What would you do if you found out the employee you just fired was the new CEO's son? A manager learns this shocking truth too late, but the story doesn't end there. This emotional roller coaster of betrayal, redemption, and second chances will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to see how one decision changed everything, for everyone involved. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. The office buzzed with the muted hum of computers, punctuated by the occasional ringing phone. It was the kind of sterile, high-pressure environment where everyone walked fast and spoke faster, their voices tinged with the unspoken fear of being replaceable. Richard Lane, the department manager, sat at the head of the conference table, his piercing gaze sweeping across the faces of his team. He had always prided himself on being a no-nonsense leader, efficient, direct, and unyielding. To him, leadership wasn't about hand-holding. It was about results, and anyone who couldn't deliver was, in his eyes, a liability. "Quarterly performance reports are in," Richard began, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming rhythmically on the table. "Some of you are exceeding expectations. Others—" His eyes lingered on one employee, a young man seated at the far end of the table, "are making it hard for me to justify their place here." All eyes shifted toward the employee, Nathan. He sat upright, his posture betraying a quiet strength despite the weight of the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. Nathan's wheelchair was parked just slightly behind the table's edge, as though he were trying to take up as little space as possible in a room that often treated him like he didn't belong. His face remained calm, but his hands gripped the armrests tightly, his knuckles pale. Richard let the silence stretch for a moment longer, savoring the tension. "Nathan," he said, finally breaking it, "your latest report, underwhelming to say the least. If you can't keep pace with the rest of the team, I'm going to have to make some tough decisions." Nathan held his gaze, refusing to shrink under the weight of the scrutiny. "I appreciate the feedback," he said evenly, his voice steady but tinged with a sharp edge. "But I'd suggest you review my previous contributions before making any decisions. I think you'll find that my results speak for themselves." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. It wasn't often that anyone challenged Richard, let alone someone like Nathan, someone who, by all appearances, should have been grateful just to have a seat at the table. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. He hated being defied, especially in front of his team. "We'll see about that," Richard said coldly. His eyes flicked to his assistant. "Claire, schedule a follow-up meeting for later this week. I want a full performance review on my desk by tomorrow." Nathan said nothing further. He'd made his point, and he wasn't about to argue in front of an audience. But as the meeting ended, and the team filed out of the room, the air between him and Richard crackled with unspoken tension. Nathan could feel the eyes of his co-workers on him, some filled with pity, others with unease. He wasn't new to being underestimated. In fact, he'd come to expect it. But this felt different. Back at his desk, Nathan opened his laptop, his fingers moving with practiced ease across the keys. His workspace was meticulously organized, folders labeled, files neatly stacked. A small framed photo sat beside his monitor, showing him and his father on a fishing trip, their smiles wide and genuine. The memory of that day flickered in his mind, a brief reprieve from the growing knot in his chest. His father's words echoed in his ears. "The world won't always be fair, son, but that doesn't mean you stop fighting for your place in it." Nathan exhaled slowly, willing the tension to dissolve. He'd been here before, doubted, dismissed, written off, and every time he'd proven them wrong. This would be no different. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play, a shadow moving just beyond his line of sight. Meanwhile, Richard paced his office, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He prided himself on being in control, but something about Nathan, his composure, his quiet defiance, unnerved him. It wasn't just about the numbers. It was about principle. Richard had worked too hard to tolerate anything less than perfection on his team. If Nathan couldn't meet the bar, then he didn't belong, no matter how sympathetic his story might be. But as Richard glanced at the stack of reports on his desk, a nagging thought crept into his mind. What if he's right? It was a question he refused to entertain for long. After all, in the cutthroat world of corporate politics, second chances were a luxury no one could afford. Later that afternoon, Richard sat in his glass-walled office, the skyline of the city stretching endlessly behind him. The faint sounds of the office hummed on the other side of the door, but his mind was focused on the performance reports spread out across his desk. He had reviewed Nathan's numbers twice, but the data told a story he didn't want to admit. Despite his earlier critique, Nathan's results weren't just adequate, they were solid, even impressive in some areas. Richard leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose in frustration. There was no room for sentiment in his position. Numbers weren't enough. Efficiency, adaptability, and team cohesion, those were the qualities he valued most, and in his eyes, Nathan's presence disrupted the delicate balance he had built. He reached for the phone to call Claire, but a knock at his door interrupted him. Without waiting for a reply, Claire stepped inside, her tablet tucked against her chest. "Richard," she began, her tone cautious, "I know you wanted the full performance review, but I thought you might want to see this first." She handed him a folder, her expression unreadable. Richard flipped it open, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. It was a list of company-wide initiatives Nathan had spearheaded, initiatives that had not only saved the department money, but had also streamlined processes Richard himself had struggled to implement. Attached were emails from other managers praising Nathan's contributions, and even a few notes from clients commending his attention to detail. "This doesn't change my decision," Richard said curtly, snapping the folder shut. Claire hesitated, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "I understand, but—" She paused, glancing toward the glass walls as if ensuring no one could overhear. "There's something else. The new CEO has been asking questions about Nathan, specifically about how he's been treated since he joined the company." Richard stiffened. "What do you mean, asking questions?" "I mean," Claire said slowly, "he asked for Nathan's personnel file yesterday. I wasn't going to mention it, but I thought you should know." The room fell into silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Richard's mind raced. Why would the CEO be interested in Nathan? It couldn't be because of his disability. The company had always maintained an inclusive image, even if in practice it left much to be desired. Was it possible Nathan had gone over his head, filed a complaint? No, Nathan wasn't the type. He wasn't a complainer. If anything, that was part of the problem. Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "Do you think this has something to do with the restructuring?" "I'm not sure," Claire replied carefully. "But I've worked with enough executives to know that when the CEO takes a personal interest in someone, it's not random." Richard's stomach tightened. He dismissed Claire with a nod, and as she left, he stared at the closed folder in front of him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of doubt, not just in his decision to fire Nathan, but in his understanding of the dynamics at play. Meanwhile, on the other side of the office, Nathan sat at his desk, methodically packing his belongings into a cardboard box. He moved slowly, his movements deliberate as if each item carried the weight of his years of effort. A coworker, Karen, approached, her expression a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. "I'm sorry, Nathan," she said softly. This isn't fair." Nathan glanced up, offering her a small, tired smile. "Fairness has never been the game, Karen. It's about playing the cards you're dealt." He held up a framed photo of his father, his fingers brushing the edge. "I'm used to it." Karen hesitated as if debating whether to say more, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "For what it's worth, I don't think this is the end. Not for you." Nathan didn't respond. He simply nodded, his focus shifting back to the box in front of him. But as Karen walked away, he couldn't help but wonder if she was right. Somewhere in the back of his mind, A small voice urged him to hold on just a little longer. The story wasn't over yet. That evening, as the office emptied and the lights dimmed, Richard remained in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The bustling energy of the day had given way to silence, but his thoughts were anything but calm. The CEO's interest in Nathan gnawed at him. There had to be more to it, something he was missing. He told himself it was just another employee who happened to catch the CEO's attention. A coincidence, nothing more. Yet the unease persisted, clinging to him like a shadow. He sat back at his desk, reaching for Nathan's personnel file. Flipping through its pages, Richard paused at the employee evaluation forms. They were filled with glowing remarks, not just from supervisors, but also from team members and external partners. Words like dedicated, innovative, and resilient jumped out at him. Each comment felt like a subtle rebuke, a reminder of how little he truly knew about the man he had just dismissed. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Claire. He sighed and picked up. "Richard," her voice came through, calm but firm. "You need to know this. The CEO is scheduling a company-wide meeting for tomorrow morning. He didn't give details, but..." She hesitated. "It might be about Nathan." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "Why would it be about Nathan? He's just another employee." "I don't know," Claire said, her tone sharpening slightly. "But don't you think it's strange that he's taking such an interest in someone you just fired? I thought you'd want to be prepared." Richard ended the call without replying. His mind was spinning. What if he had overlooked something critical? What if this wasn't just about Nathan's performance, or even his disability? What if Nathan had connections he hadn't accounted for? As the thought lingered, Richard's chest tightened. He hated the idea that he might have underestimated someone. His entire career had been built on control, on being the smartest person in the room. But now, for the first time in years, he felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting, and he had no idea how to steady himself. Elsewhere, Nathan sat in his small apartment, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His packed box sat by the door, a tangible reminder of the day's events. He stared at it for a long moment before turning back to his laptop. Opening an email draft, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was addressed to his father, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what had happened without making it sound like a plea for help? That wasn't who he was. He had taken this job to prove himself, not to his father, not to Richard, but to himself. And yet here he was, staring at a blank screen, the weight of the day pressing down on him. A memory surfaced, his father's voice from years ago. "Nathan, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You're already enough just as you are. But if you want something, go for it. Don't let anyone stand in your way." The words settled in his chest, both comforting and bittersweet. His father had always believed in him, even when the rest of the world didn't. Nathan closed the laptop without sending the email. He didn't need his father to fight his battles. Tomorrow he would go to the office for the last time, hand in his ID badge, and walk out with his head held high. Whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms. The next morning, the office was abuzz with speculation. Word of the CEO's sudden meeting had spread like wildfire, and everyone was on edge. Richard arrived early, his usual air of confidence noticeably strained. He tried to focus on his tasks, but the whispers around him were impossible to ignore. "I heard it's about layoffs," one employee murmured. "No, it's about that guy, Nathan," another replied. "Didn't he just get fired? Why would the CEO care about that?" Richard clenched his jaw and strode past them, shutting his office door behind him. He didn't have time for gossip. Whatever the CEO had planned, he needed to be ready. At exactly 10 o'clock, the employees gathered in the conference room, the air thick with anticipation. Richard sat near the front, his posture stiff, while Nathan stood quietly in the back, his expression unreadable. The CEO entered moments later, his presence commanding the room's attention. He was a tall man, with a calm demeanor that belied the sharp intellect behind his eyes. "Good morning, everyone," the CEO began. his voice steady and deliberate. "I called this meeting today to address an issue that's been brought to my attention, an issue that goes to the heart of who we are as a company." Richard's pulse quickened. The CEO's gaze swept across the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on Nathan before moving on. This company was built on the idea that talent and dedication are what drive success, not appearances, not background, and certainly not assumptions about what someone can or cannot do. Unfortunately, it seems that principle has been forgotten by some. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Richard's palms began to sweat. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, panic began to bubble. Was this about him? About Nathan? The CEO continued, his tone growing sharper. "Let me be clear. Our greatest strength as a company is our people. When we fail to recognize the value they bring, we not only fail them, we fail ourselves." Richard's heart pounded as the CEO turned and looked directly at him. For the first time in years, he felt completely exposed, and he didn't like it one bit. The tension in the room was palpable as the CEO allowed his words to settle. He let the silence linger for a moment, his sharp gaze moving deliberately from face to face. When his eyes briefly met Richard's, there was something unreadable in them. Calm, but heavy with unspoken meaning. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers curling into fists beneath the table. "I want to share a story," the CEO continued, his tone softening but losing none of its gravity. "It's about a young man who, against all odds, refused to let the world define him. He faced challenges that most of us can only imagine: prejudice, dismissal, and the ever-present belief that he would never be enough." The room was utterly silent now, every employee hanging on his words. Even Richard, despite his rising anxiety, couldn't look away. The CEO's voice carried a quiet intensity that commanded attention. This young man didn't let any of it stop him. He worked harder, thought smarter, and found ways to succeed where others had failed. But here's the thing. The CEO paused, a faint smile playing on his lips. Success wasn't enough for him. He wanted to make a difference. He wanted to contribute, to build something greater than himself. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know where this was going, but the pit in his stomach was growing by the second. The story felt pointed, too deliberate to be a coincidence. His gaze darted toward Nathan, who stood quietly at the back of the room, his expression unreadable. The CEO straightened, his voice growing firmer. And yet, even with all his accomplishments, he was still underestimated, overlooked, written off by those who couldn't see past their own assumptions. There it was. The air seemed to shift, and Richard's stomach turned to lead. He knew without a doubt that this was about Nathan. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he didn't want to believe it. It couldn't be true. Not this. The CEO took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Richard. "Sometimes we make mistakes. We allow our biases to cloud our judgment, and in doing so we fail to recognize the true potential of those around us. And sometimes—" His gaze flickered briefly toward Nathan, then back to Richard. "Those mistakes come at a cost." A murmur rippled through the room as the weight of the words settled over the employees. Richard felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to defend himself, to say something, anything, but his throat felt like it was closing. The CEO took a deep breath, his tone softening once more. "This company has always been about more than profits. It's about values, integrity, respect. And today, we have an opportunity to reflect on whether we're truly living up to those ideals." Richard's head spun. He could feel the eyes of the room on him now, whispers and glances barely concealed. The humiliation was unbearable, but what scared him most was the growing certainty of what was coming next. The CEO turned to face the employees, his expression grave but resolute. "Before we move forward, I'd like to formally introduce someone who exemplifies those values every single day." Someone who has made an indelible impact on this company. He gestured toward the back of the room. Nathan, would you join me, please? The room collectively turned, and all eyes landed on Nathan. He hesitated for a moment, his surprise evident, before slowly wheeling himself forward. The sound of his wheelchair against the floor echoed in the hushed space. As he approached, the CEO reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of both pride and solidarity. Richard sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. His worst fears were confirmed as the CEO's next words cut through the silence like a blade. Nathan isn't just an exceptional employee, the CEO said, his voice steady and clear. He's also my son. The revelation sent a shockwave through the room. Gasps and murmurs erupted, employees exchanging stunned looks. Richard felt the blood drain from his face, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had just heard. The CEO's son. Nathan was the CEO's son. How had he not seen this coming? How could he have been so blind? Nathan, for his part, remained composed. He glanced briefly at Richard, his expression calm but unreadable, before turning back to the CEO. The moment hung heavy in the air, and for the first time in his career, Richard felt utterly and completely out of control. The room buzzed with an undercurrent of disbelief, the employees exchanging wide-eyed glances as the revelation settled in. The CEO allowed the moment to breathe, standing beside Nathan with a calm but commanding presence. Richard, however, felt his world crumbling. His mind raced, replaying every interaction he'd had with Nathan, every dismissive comment, every judgmental glance. How could he have missed the signs? Clearing his throat, the CEO spoke again, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a scalpel. Some of you might be wondering why Nathan chose to join this company without revealing who he is. It's simple. He wanted to earn his place here on his own merits. He didn't want his name, or mine, to overshadow his abilities. Nathan nodded, his expression remaining steady as he addressed the room for the first time. I've never been one to take shortcuts, he said, his tone even but laced with conviction. I believe in hard work, in proving myself, and for the most part I've been able to do that, but... His gaze swept across the room, finally landing on Richard. There have been moments where I've been reminded that no matter how much you contribute, there are people who will never see past what they perceive as a weakness. Richard's breath hitched. The words weren't overtly hostile, but they hit like a gut punch nonetheless. Nathan didn't break eye contact, his composure unwavering. What I've learned is that strength isn't about proving others wrong. It's about staying true to who you are, even when it feels like the world is against you. The room was silent, captivated by the quiet power in Nathan's voice. Even the skeptics, those who had doubted him or whispered behind his back, seemed to shift in their seats, uncomfortable but reflective. Richard, however, sat rigid, his mind a whirlwind of shame, anger, and panic. The CEO placed a hand on Nathan's shoulder, his pride unmistakable. Nathan has shown extraordinary resilience and innovation during his time here. His work has directly contributed to some of the company's recent successes that frankly would not have been possible without him. And yet, despite all of this, he was treated as though he didn't belong. Though the words were directed at the room, they felt laser-focused on Richard. His stomach churned as the CEO continued. This is a moment for all of us to reflect, not just as individuals, but as a company. Are we living up to our values? Are we creating an environment where everyone has the opportunity to thrive? Or are we allowing personal biases to cloud our judgment? The CEO's tone sharpened as he glanced toward Richard. Leadership isn't about authority. It's about vision, integrity, and the ability to lift others up, not tear them down. The implicit criticism hung heavy in the air, and Richard felt his face flush. He opened his mouth to respond, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he hadn't known who Nathan was? That he'd fired him because it was just business? None of it sounded good, not in his head and certainly not aloud. Instead, the CEO turned his focus back to the employees. "I want to make something very clear," he said firmly. "This company will always prioritize talent and dedication above all else. But that means we must also hold ourselves accountable when we fall short. Mistakes were made here, and they will be addressed." A ripple of unease spread through the room as the CEO's words landed. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the noose tightening, though he didn't yet know how it would be drawn. Nathan, sensing the tension, spoke up once more, his voice softer now. "I'm not here to punish anyone," he said, surprising the room. "I'm here because I believe in what this company can be. I believe in its mission, and I believe in the people who work here. All I've ever wanted was a fair shot to contribute, to be seen for who I am, not for what people assume about me." The sincerity in his words resonated, and several employees nodded in agreement. Richard, however, felt like he was sinking deeper into his chair. He had spent years building a reputation as a decisive, results-driven leader. Now, all of that felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The CEO straightened, his expression softening as he looked at Nathan. "You've proven yourself in every way that matters," he said, "and I have no doubt you'll continue to do so. Starting today, Nathan will be taking on a larger role within the company. He'll be leading a new initiative that reflects the values we stand for: innovation, inclusion, and excellence." The room erupted into polite applause, though the tension lingered. Nathan offered a small, humble smile, but his eyes briefly flickered back to Richard, who remained frozen in his seat. The unspoken message was clear: the dynamic had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same. As the meeting adjourned, employees began to file out, whispering amongst themselves. Richard remained seated, staring blankly at the table. The CEO lingered for a moment, then approached him, his expression unreadable. "Richard," he said quietly, "we'll need to have a conversation about your role here. My office. This afternoon." And with that he walked away, leaving Richard alone in the now empty room, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like never before. Richard sat motionless in the empty conference room, the CEO's words echoing in his head. "We'll need to have a conversation about your role here." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement that carried the weight of inevitability, the kind that made his stomach churn. He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the polished floor, and stood unsteadily. His mind raced as he made his way back to his office. Every step felt heavier than the last. What would the CEO say? Was this the beginning of the end for him? He couldn't shake the image of Nathan standing beside the CEO, calm and resolute. The thought burned, not because Nathan had done anything wrong, quite the opposite, but because Richard now knew he had. He shut the door behind him and slumped into his chair, his hands trembling as he loosened his tie. For years he had lived by a set of principles: be decisive, prioritize results, and never let emotions get in the way. But now, those principles felt hollow. Had they blinded him to the very people he was supposed to lead? Had his obsession with control and efficiency made him incapable of seeing potential when it stared him in the face? Richard's eyes fell on the folder Claire had given him earlier, still sitting on the edge of his desk. He opened it again, this time forcing himself to read every word. The list of Nathan's contributions was staggering, not just in scope, but in impact. Streamlined workflows, cost-saving measures, innovative solutions to problems Richard hadn't even been aware of. And yet, he had dismissed all of it because Nathan didn't fit his narrow vision of what a perfect employee should look like. He rubbed his temples, a wave of guilt washing over him. The worst part wasn't that he had fired Nathan. It was that, until this moment, he hadn't even questioned whether it was the right thing to do. To him, it had been a simple, pragmatic decision. But now, as the truth stared him in the face, he realized just how flawed his judgment had been. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Claire, her face unreadable. "The CEO is ready for you," she said simply. Richard nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he stood. The walk to the CEO's office felt like a gauntlet. Every passing employee seemed to glance his way, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet judgment. The whispers that followed him were faint, but he could feel their weight all the same. When he reached the CEO's office, the door was already open. The CEO sat behind his desk, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Nathan was seated in a chair to the side, his presence a silent reminder of everything Richard had misjudged. "Come in, Richard," the CEO said, gesturing toward the chair opposite him. His tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Richard stepped inside, his heart pounding, and took a seat. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound amplifying the tension in the room. The CEO leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "I think you know why we're here." Richard nodded, his mouth dry. "I do." "Good," the CEO said, his tone steady but firm. "Then let me make one thing clear. Your decision to fire Nathan was unacceptable, not just because of who he is, but because of what it represents. It showed a lack of vision, a failure to recognize talent, and frankly, a disregard for the values this company stands for." Richard flinched at the words but forced himself to meet the CEO's gaze. I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't see the bigger picture. I let my biases cloud my judgment." The CEO raised an eyebrow. "And now that you do see it, what do you intend to do about it?" Richard hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. He glanced at Nathan, who watched him silently, his expression unreadable. "I want to fix this," Richard said finally. "I don't know how, but I want to make it right." Nathan spoke for the first time, his voice calm but firm. "It's not about fixing what's already done, Richard. It's about learning from it. About ensuring that no one else has to go through what I did." Richard nodded slowly. "You're right. I failed you. I failed this team. And I know an apology isn't enough, but I want you to know that I see it now. I see you." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the words hanging heavy. Finally, the CEO leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "Acknowledging your mistakes is a start," he said. "But actions speak louder than words. Moving forward, you'll be reporting directly to Nathan as part of his new initiative. Consider this an opportunity to learn, to rebuild trust, not just with Nathan, but with this company." Richard's eyes widened, the words hitting him like a blow. Reporting to Nathan? The very idea was both humbling and humiliating. But as he glanced at Nathan again, he realized it was also exactly what he deserved. "I understand," Richard said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "And I'll do my best to prove that I can be better." The CEO nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Good. Then let's get to work." Nathan stood, offering Richard a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning to leave the room. Richard watched him go, a mixture of gratitude and regret swirling in his chest. As the door closed behind him, he let out a long, shaky breath. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something unfamiliar. Hope. Richard returned to his office, the conversation with the CEO replaying in his mind. The reality of his new position, reporting to Nathan, hung over him like a storm cloud. He couldn't deny the sting to his pride. For years he had been the one in control, the one making decisions that shaped the company's future. Now he was being asked to take a step back, to learn from someone he had dismissed as insignificant. It was humbling, and perhaps that was the point. Sitting at his desk, he stared at the blank notepad in front of him, his pen resting idly in his hand. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know where to begin. His usual confidence had been replaced by doubt, and the silence of the room only made it worse. He wanted to push the blame outward, to justify his actions as necessary decisions for the company. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just about Nathan, it was about who he had become. The sound of a soft knock at his door broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Nathan, his wheelchair positioned just inside the doorway. His face was calm, but his eyes held an intensity that made Richard feel exposed. "Do you have a minute?" Nathan asked. Richard nodded, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "Of course, please come in." Nathan rolled into the office, stopping just short of the desk. He didn't bother with pleasantries or small talk. "I wanted to talk about how we move forward," he said simply. Richard straightened in his chair, setting the pen down. "I'm ready to listen." Nathan raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "I hope so, because this isn't going to work if you're not willing to let go of the way you've been doing things." The directness of the statement stung, but Richard couldn't deny the truth of it. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I've been too focused on control, on results, and I've ignored the people behind those results. That needs to change." Nathan leaned back slightly, studying him. "It's a start," he said after a moment. "But actions matter more than words, Richard. I need to see that you're willing to collaborate, to trust the people around you. That's the only way this works." Richard exhaled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own guilt. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said quietly. "I mean that." Nathan nodded, his expression softening. "Good. Then here's where we start." He placed a folder on the desk, sliding it toward Richard. "This is the initiative I'll be leading. It's focused on developing a more inclusive workplace, not just for people with disabilities, but for anyone who feels overlooked or undervalued." Richard opened the folder, skimming the contents. The proposal was thorough, well-researched, and ambitious. It outlined training programs for managers, mentorship opportunities for underrepresented employees, and policies to ensure fair evaluations across all departments. It was the kind of forward-thinking approach the company desperately needed, and Richard couldn't help but feel a pang of regret that he hadn't been the one to spearhead it. "This is impressive," he admitted, glancing up at Nathan. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this." "I have," Nathan said simply, "because I've lived it. I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to have to work twice as hard just to prove you belong. And I know I'm not the only one." Richard closed the folder, his jaw tightening. "I can't change the past, Nathan, but I want to help make this happen. Whatever you need, I'm here." Nathan studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, he nodded. "We'll see." The conversation ended with a handshake, firm but brief. As Nathan wheeled out of the office, Richard felt a strange mix of emotions. Shame for how he had treated Nathan, gratitude for the opportunity to make amends, and a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Respect. He opened the folder again, diving into the details of the initiative. For the first time in years, his work felt less like a chore and more like a chance to build something meaningful. And though the road ahead would be steep, he resolved to take it one step at a time, starting now. The days that followed felt like uncharted territory for Richard. Used to being the one giving orders, he now found himself taking direction from Nathan. It was a humbling shift, but it also forced him to confront his own habits and assumptions. Nathan, for his part, didn't make things easy. He held Richard accountable for every detail, every decision, and every interaction with the team. There were no shortcuts, no easy paths to redemption. Their first meeting to discuss the new initiative was a quiet but tense affair. Nathan sat at the head of the table, his usual calm demeanor masking the intensity of his expectations. Richard sat a few seats down, surrounded by other department heads who had been brought in to contribute to the project. The atmosphere was professional, but Richard could feel the undercurrent of curiosity and judgment in the air. He knew the others were watching him closely, waiting to see how he would handle his new position. Nathan began the meeting by laying out the framework of the initiative. "Our goal," he said, his voice steady, "is to create a workplace where everyone feels seen, valued, and empowered to contribute. This isn't just about policies, it's about culture. And changing culture requires all of us to look at how we lead, how we collaborate, and how we communicate." He glanced around the table, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Each of you brings something unique to this team, and I expect you to use that perspective to drive this forward. That includes you, Richard. Richard nodded, his face carefully neutral. I'm ready to contribute. Good, Nathan replied, though his tone was clipped. Because I'm assigning you to oversee the implementation of our mentorship program. There was a beat of silence as the other department heads exchanged glances. Richard felt his chest tighten. The mentorship program was one of the most ambitious components of the initiative, designed to pair underrepresented employees with senior leaders for guidance and support. It was a cornerstone of Nathan's vision, and the responsibility of leading it wasn't lost on Richard. I'll make it happen, Richard said, his voice firm despite the weight of the task. Nathan's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he nodded. Good. I expect regular updates on your progress. And remember, this isn't about checking boxes. It's about real impact. The meeting continued, with each department head outlining their contributions to the initiative. Richard listened closely, taking notes and absorbing the dynamics of the team. It was clear that Nathan commanded their respect, not through authority, but through the strength of his vision and the integrity of his actions. It was a kind of leadership Richard had rarely seen, and one he wasn't sure he could replicate. After the meeting, as the team dispersed, Nathan stopped Richard just outside the conference room. A word, he said, gesturing for Richard to follow him. They stepped into Nathan's smaller, newly assigned office. It wasn't flashy, but it was functional, with a stack of reports neatly arranged on the desk, and a small framed photo of Nathan and his father on the windowsill. Nathan closed the door behind them and turned to face Richard. I assigned you the mentorship program for a reason, Nathan said, his tone measured. It's not just about the program itself, it's about you. Richard frowned, unsure of where this was going. What do you mean? Nathan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the desk. You've spent your career making decisions from a distance. You look at numbers, policies, and outcomes, but you don't see the people behind them. This program is your chance to change that. Richard absorbed the words, feeling their weight. I want to do better, he said quietly. I'm not the same person I was a week ago. Nathan tilted his head, considering him. Then show me, because this isn't about what you say. It's about what you do. The people in this program need someone who believes in them, someone who sees their potential even when no one else does. Can you be that person? Richard hesitated, the question hitting him harder than he expected. He thought about all the times he had dismissed someone like Nathan, all the opportunities he had overlooked because of his own biases. He thought about the guilt that still lingered, and the chance he had now to make things right. I'll do everything I can, he said finally, not just for the program, but for the people in it. Nathan studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good, because the first mentorship pairing is with you. Richard's eyes widened. What? You're going to mentor someone, Nathan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It's not negotiable. If you're serious about changing, this is where you start. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. Nathan didn't wait for an answer. He handed Richard a file and wheeled back toward his desk. You'll meet them tomorrow, Nathan said, dismissing him with a glance. I suggest you prepare. Richard left the office, the file clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't need to open it to know that this was going to be one of the most challenging and important tasks of his career. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just leading. He was being asked to grow, and deep down, he knew Nathan was right. This was where it had to start. The next morning, Richard sat at his desk, staring at the unopened file Nathan had given him. His coffee sat untouched beside him, growing cold as he wrestled with the unease creeping up his spine. He had led countless teams, conducted dozens of reviews, and fired more people than he cared to admit. Yet the thought of mentoring someone, of stepping into a role that required more empathy than authority, unnerved him in a way he didn't fully understand. Finally, he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the name at the top. Emily Torres. The profile that followed detailed her background, a bright, driven junior analyst who had been with the company for just under a year. Her performance evaluations were strong, but there were notes about her struggles with confidence and her hesitancy to speak up in meetings. She was described as quiet but capable, a phrase that struck Richard in a way he hadn't expected. He couldn't help but wonder how many times he had overlooked someone like Emily in his quest for efficiency. The file also included a short paragraph written by Emily herself, part of the mentorship program's application process. Richard read it twice, the words lingering in his mind. "I want to feel like I belong here. I know I have ideas worth sharing, but sometimes it's hard to find my voice in a room where everyone else seems louder and more confident. I'm hoping this program will help me find that voice, and maybe help others see what I can bring to the table." Richard closed the folder, exhaling slowly. The words hit uncomfortably close to home. He saw traces of Nathan in Emily's statement, and, in an unexpected way, traces of himself. How many times had he silenced his own insecurities by overpowering others, by dismissing their potential to bolster his own? The thought unsettled him, but it also solidified his resolve. He owed it to Nathan, and to himself, to make this work. Later that day, Richard found himself in one of the smaller conference rooms, waiting for Emily to arrive. The room was quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. He checked his watch, feeling the familiar stirrings of impatience, but forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't about him. It was about her. When the door finally opened, Emily stepped inside, clutching a notebook to her chest. She was petite, with dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her expression was a mix of nervousness and determination. She glanced at Richard, then quickly looked away, as though unsure if she was allowed to meet his gaze. "Emily," Richard said, standing and extending a hand. She nodded, her grip firm but hesitant. "Yes, Mr. Lane. It's nice to meet you." "Just Richard," he corrected, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Please have a seat." She sat down, her posture stiff but attentive, her notebook still clutched tightly in her lap. Richard took a moment to study her, noting the way her eyes darted toward the door as though considering an escape route. He recognized the look. It was the same one he had seen in Nathan during their first meeting. A mix of hope and fear. "I've gone through your file," Richard began, keeping his tone as gentle as he could manage. "You've done some great work here so far. I can see why you were selected for this program." Emily's cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked down at her notebook. "Thank you," she murmured. "I've been trying, but sometimes it feels like I'm just treading water, like I'm not making much of an impact." Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "What makes you feel that way?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe it's because I don't speak up enough, or because I don't fit the image of what people expect in a meeting. Everyone else seems so sure of themselves, and I—" She trailed off, her voice faltering. Richard felt a pang of recognition. He had dismissed people like Emily in the past, seeing their quietness as a lack of drive rather than a strength waiting to be nurtured. But now, sitting across from her, he saw the courage it took for her to admit her fears, to show up despite them. "I get it," he said finally. "More than you might think. It's easy to feel like you're being drowned out in a room full of loud voices, but sometimes the quiet voices are the ones worth listening to." Emily's eyes flicked up to meet his, her expression softening. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," Richard said, and for the first time in a long while he meant it. "And I think you're capable of a lot more than you give yourself credit for. My job is to help you see that, and to make sure everyone else does too." She nodded slowly, her grip on the notebook relaxing just a little. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That means a lot." Richard smiled, a small but genuine expression that felt unfamiliar on his face. "Let's start with one step at a time," he said. "What's one thing you'd like to work on? One goal you want to achieve?" Emily hesitated for only a moment before answering. "I want to speak up in meetings," she said firmly. "I want to feel like my voice matters." Richard nodded, a flicker of admiration sparking within him. "Then that's where we'll start. As the conversation continued, Richard found himself surprised by how much he enjoyed the interaction. Emily's vulnerability was matched by a quiet strength that reminded him of Nathan, and in some ways of the person he had once aspired to be. For the first time in years, he felt like he was building something meaningful, not just for the company, but for the people within it. And for the first time, he felt like he was finally starting to change. The mentorship meetings with Emily became a regular part of Richard's routine, and with each session, he began to see her transformation and his own. At first, their conversations were tentative, like testing the waters of a fragile truce. Emily shared her ideas hesitantly, as if waiting for Richard to dismiss them. But instead of brushing her off, he leaned in, asking questions and encouraging her to dig deeper. Slowly, her confidence grew. One afternoon, as they reviewed a presentation Emily had prepared for an upcoming team meeting, Richard noticed something different. Her voice carried more certainty, her explanations more conviction. She pointed out areas where the team could improve, her insights sharp and thoughtful. "You've got a knack for spotting inefficiencies," Richard said, genuinely impressed. "This is solid work." Emily smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting in a way that hinted at pride. "Thank you. I wasn't sure if it was too critical." "Not at all," Richard replied. "Being critical isn't the problem. It's how you frame it, and you've done that well here. If anything, you're showing the team how we can do better." Her smile widened slightly, and for a moment, Richard saw a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was the same spark he had seen in Nathan, an unyielding belief in the potential for change, even in the face of doubt. But the road wasn't without its bumps. One morning during a larger team meeting, Emily attempted to voice one of her ideas. Her words were thoughtful, her tone steady, but before she could finish, another senior analyst interrupted her, dismissing the suggestion with a wave of his hand. "That's not going to work," the analyst said bluntly. "We've already tried something similar, and it didn't go anywhere." Emily's voice faltered, her confidence visibly shaken. She nodded quickly, retreating into silence as the conversation moved on. Richard watched the interaction, anger simmering just below the surface. He had been in that analyst's position before, dismissing ideas, cutting people off. And now, for the first time, he saw the damage it could cause. When the meeting ended, Richard caught up with Emily as she packed up her things, her shoulders tense. "Emily," he said gently, stopping her before she could leave. "Can we talk for a minute?" She hesitated, her fingers clutching the strap of her bag, but nodded. "Sure." They stepped into a quiet corner of the office, away from the buzz of the team. Richard could see the frustration and doubt etched into her expression. "I saw what happened in there," he said, his tone steady. "You had a great idea, and it deserved more consideration than it got." Emily shook her head, her voice tight. "It doesn't matter, maybe he's right. Maybe it wouldn't work." "Maybe," Richard admitted. "But it's not about whether every idea works. It's about having the space to share them without being dismissed. What you said in there was valuable, and it wasn't fair for it to be shut down like that." Emily glanced at him, her expression softening. I don't know how to push back without making it worse." "That's something we'll work on," Richard said firmly. "You have a voice, Emily, and it matters. It's not just about speaking up. It's about knowing that what you're saying deserves to be heard." She nodded slowly, the tension in her posture easing. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I'll try." The following week, Richard made it a point to support Emily during another team meeting. As the discussion began to wind down, he turned to her, his tone casual but deliberate. "Emily, I believe you had a suggestion for streamlining the data collection process," he said, his words drawing the attention of the entire room. Emily froze for a moment, her gaze darting around the table. Richard caught her eye, giving her a small, reassuring nod. "Yes," she said, her voice steadying as she continued. "I've been reviewing the process, and I noticed that a lot of time is spent on redundant steps. If we consolidate the reporting tools and automate some of the manual tasks, we could cut that time in half." This time there was no interruption. The room was quiet as Emily explained her proposal, her confidence growing with every word. When she finished, several team members nodded in agreement, and one even chimed in with a follow-up question. "That's an excellent point," Richard said, his tone firm. "Let's work on implementing that in the next cycle." Emily's face lit up, the kind of quiet pride that comes from being truly seen. As the meeting wrapped up, she glanced at Richard, her gratitude unspoken but clear. He nodded back, feeling a swell of something he hadn't expected. Pride, not just in her, but in himself. Later that evening, Richard reflected on the day as he packed up his things. For so long, his leadership style had been about control, about proving himself through authority. But now, he was starting to understand that real leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about creating space for others to find theirs. And for the first time, he felt like he was beginning to get it right. Weeks passed, and Richard found himself adapting to his new role in ways he hadn't anticipated. The mentorship program had become more than just a professional obligation. It was a lens through which he reevaluated not only his leadership but also his interactions with others. Emily continued to grow, gaining confidence with each passing day. Her contributions in meetings were now met with respect, and her insights began shaping the team's strategies in ways Richard hadn't foreseen. But change wasn't confined to Emily alone. Richard's approach to leadership had shifted. Where he had once dismissed quieter voices, he now sought them out. He began sitting with employees he'd previously overlooked, listening to their ideas and understanding their perspectives. The walls he'd built around himself, his pride, his need for control, were beginning to crumble. Still, one person loomed over his thoughts more than anyone else: Nathan. Their interactions had remained professional but distant. Nathan had been deliberate in giving Richard room to grow, offering guidance only when needed, but the weight of their shared history lingered between them. Richard wanted to say something, to bridge the gap that his mistakes had created, but he wasn't sure how. The opportunity came one late afternoon. Most of the office had emptied, the quiet punctuated only by the faint hum of computers. Richard had stayed behind to finalize his updates on the mentorship program when he noticed Nathan wheeling past his office. Acting on impulse, he called out, "Nathan, got a minute?" Nathan paused, his expression neutral. "Sure." He rolled into the office, stopping just short of Richard's desk. "What's on your mind?" Richard gestured to the chair across from him, though Nathan didn't move to sit. "I wanted to talk to you about everything, about how things have been going." Nathan raised an eyebrow, waiting. Richard felt the weight of the moment, the silence pressing on him as he searched for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about the past few weeks," Richard began, his voice measured, "about the decisions I made before and how wrong I was. Not just about you, but about how I've led this team for years." Nathan said nothing, his gaze steady, and Richard continued. "When I fired you, I didn't just make a mistake. I showed a lack of vision, a lack of empathy. I failed to see you for who you are, and for that, I'm truly sorry." The sincerity in Richard's voice was unmistakable, and for a moment Nathan's expression softened. But he remained silent, letting Richard continue. "This mentorship program," Richard said, glancing at the folder on his desk, "it's opened my eyes to what leadership really means. It's not about control or authority. It's about people. I've seen what Emily is capable of, how much potential I've ignored in others because I was too focused on my own narrow vision. And I owe that to you, Nathan. You gave me this chance to change, even when I didn't deserve it." Nathan leaned back slightly, his arms resting on the wheels of his chair. "I didn't give you anything, Richard," he said quietly. "You earned this change by choosing to confront what you've been avoiding. But that doesn't erase the past." Richard nodded, the words landing heavily. "I know. And I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I see things differently now. I see you differently." Nathan studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "You've made progress," he said, his tone even. "But the real test isn't what you say in here. It's how you act out there. Are you going to keep this up when it's hard, when it's inconvenient? Because that's what matters." Richard met his gaze, the weight of the challenge settling over him. "I will," he said simply. "Because I want to be better. Not just for the team, but for myself." Nathan nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good. Then keep going." The conversation ended there, but as Nathan left the office, Richard felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Relief. It wasn't absolution, but it was a start. And for the first time, he felt like he was truly moving forward. The following day, Richard arrived at work earlier than usual, a quiet determination fueling him. He had a meeting scheduled with Emily to review her progress, and as he prepared, he found himself looking forward to the conversation. For so long, his work had been a series of tasks, a checklist to complete. Now it felt like something more, a chance to build, to contribute, to grow. Emily arrived right on time, her confidence evident in the way she carried herself. She had a folder of her own, filled with notes and ideas she was eager to share. As they sat down to discuss her next steps, Richard realized something that took him by surprise. He was learning as much from her as she was from him. And as the day unfolded, he couldn't help but think of Nathan's words. "The real test isn't what you say in here, it's how you act out there." For the first time, Richard felt ready to face that test, no matter how long it took. A month had passed, and the mentorship program was beginning to yield visible results. Employees who had once been hesitant to share their voices were stepping forward with ideas and insights that Richard couldn't believe he had overlooked for so long. The office felt different, more collaborative, more inclusive, and even more energized. It was as if the culture Nathan had envisioned was beginning to take root. Richard, for his part, continued to evolve. He made a conscious effort to check in with his team, not just about work, but about their well-being and aspirations. His conversations with Emily had become one of the highlights of his week. Watching her growth, the way she now commanded attention in meetings and contributed innovative ideas, filled him with a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. But that pride wasn't directed at himself. It was for her and the potential she had unlocked. One day, Nathan called a meeting with Richard to discuss the progress of the program. As they sat across from each other in Nathan's office, Richard handed over a detailed report, outlining the milestones they had achieved and the areas where they could improve. "This is good work," Nathan said, scanning the document. "The program is making a difference." Richard nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. "It is," he agreed. "But it's not just the program. It's the people. Seeing Emily grow, watching her ideas take shape, it's reminded me why I started in this field to begin with. Somewhere along the way, I forgot about the people behind the results. This program brought that back for me." Nathan glanced up, studying him. "It sounds like you're finding your footing again." Richard smiled faintly. "I hope so, but I still have a long way to go." Nathan leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "We all do," he said simply. "What matters is that you're moving in the right direction." Their conversation turned to the future of the initiative. Nathan shared his plans to expand the mentorship program, bringing in more leaders and creating additional opportunities for underrepresented employees to thrive. Richard listened intently, offering suggestions and insights where he could. The collaboration felt natural, a far cry from the tension that had once defined their relationship. As the meeting ended, Nathan paused, his tone shifting. "You know, Richard, I wasn't sure about you when this all started." Richard chuckled dryly. "That makes two of us." Nathan smiled, but there was a seriousness in his expression. "You've proven me wrong. And more importantly, you've proven to yourself that you can change. That's not easy." Richard met his gaze, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you, Nathan. That means more than you know." Nathan nodded, and with that, the meeting ended. But as Richard walked back to his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a turning point for him. It was a new beginning. A few weeks later, the company hosted a town hall to celebrate the progress of the mentorship program and to unveil the next phase of Nathan's initiative. Employees from across the organization gathered in the main conference room, the energy in the space electric. For many, it was the first time they had seen such a tangible shift in the company's culture, and the excitement was palpable. Richard stood near the back of the room, watching as Nathan took the stage. The younger man exuded confidence, his presence commanding but approachable. He began by thanking the employees for their contributions and outlining the vision for the next phase of the initiative. His words were inspiring, but they were also practical, grounded in the reality of what it would take to make lasting change. "And I want to take a moment to recognize someone who has been instrumental in making this happen," Nathan said, his gaze scanning the room. "Richard Lane." Richard froze, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't expected this. Nathan continued, a small smile on his face. "Richard has not only helped shape this program, but he's also shown what it means to grow as a leader. His willingness to challenge himself, to confront his own biases, and to support others has set an example for all of us." The room broke into applause, and Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. For so long he had prided himself on being untouchable, unflappable. But in this moment, he felt something entirely new: humility. And with it came a deep sense of fulfillment. After the town hall, as employees mingled and shared their excitement about the program, Richard found himself approached by Emily. She was beaming, her notebook tucked under her arm. "Congratulations, Richard," she said, her voice bright. "You deserve it." "Thank you, Emily," he said sincerely. "But honestly, this isn't about me. It's about you and everyone else who's stepped forward to make this work." She smiled, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. "Maybe, but you've made a difference. For me, at least." Richard nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "That's all I've ever wanted." As the evening wound down, Richard found himself standing near Nathan, watching as employees laughed and chatted around them. The tension that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by mutual respect. "You did well up there," Richard said, nodding toward the stage. "So did you," Nathan replied, his tone warm. "But don't think your work is done. This is just the beginning." Richard chuckled, his smile genuine. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As they stood together, the hum of conversation filling the air, Richard realized how much had changed, not just in the company, but in himself. He wasn't the same man who had dismissed Nathan or overlooked Emily. He was someone new, someone better. And for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that extended far beyond himself. The journey had been difficult, humbling, and uncomfortable. But it had also been worth it, because in the end it wasn't about titles or power. It was about people, and Richard was finally ready to lead with that in mind. Richard stood at the window of his office, watching as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting warm hues over the city. The journey he had undertaken wasn't just about a mentorship program or repairing his professional reputation. It was about rediscovering his humanity. He had learned that leadership wasn't about power or control, but about lifting others, seeing their potential and creating space for them to thrive. It was a lesson Nathan, Emily, and every overlooked voice in the company had taught him, and one he would carry for the rest of his life. As he reflected on the transformation, Richard understood that growth is never easy. It requires humility, the courage to face one's flaws, and the willingness to change. But the rewards, seeing others succeed, fostering collaboration, and building something meaningful, were worth every moment of discomfort. For the first time in years, Richard felt he was part of something bigger than himself, and he knew the road ahead, though challenging, would be worth every step. If this story touched your heart and left you with valuable lessons, don't forget to subscribe, for more inspiring stories. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear from you.